Claire lives with her husband, Norman, and their daughter. Today is quite an emotional day for her because Claire has to take her daughter to college. The farewell breaks her heart, even though she tries to stay strong. In their neighborhood, a new couple has just moved into the house next door. Claire seems very interested in them, especially because the couple argues almost every day. She even tells Norman about it, although her husband doesn't seem to care much. That night, Claire tries to comfort herself by thinking that the only good thing about her daughter leaving for college is that she and Norman can finally spend more time together. In the morning, Claire opens an old album and accidentally finds a photo of the car accident she had last year. Her memories of the incident are still blurry, and she feels like something about it is strange. When stepping outside, Claire hears a woman crying from the house next door. Feeling concerned, she walks closer to the fence and asks if the woman is okay. With a trembling voice, the woman says that she is scared and feels that one day her arguments with her husband could end in tragedy. Claire is shocked to hear that, but before she can say anything else, the woman's husband suddenly appears, and she immediately runs back inside the house. Later, Claire finds out that her new neighbor actually works at the same place as Norman. However, when she shares her concerns, Norman dismisses them, saying she's overreacting and that there's nothing to worry about. Claire is annoyed by his response, but Norman promises to find out more about the man. The next morning, Claire decided to welcome her new neighbors with a basket of goods. However, even after knocking multiple times, no one answered the door. That's when she noticed something that made her even more suspicious: a single women's sandal lying in front of the door. Her friend Jody came over that day and asked how she was doing. Claire said she was fine, even though deep down something was bothering her. Jody tried to comfort her, saying it must be hard for her to send her daughter off to college while also recovering from the accident. But for Claire, the hardest part was that she couldn't remember what had actually happened in the accident. One night, Claire saw her suspicious neighbor loading a large package into the trunk of his car. Fear crept over her, and she quickly woke Norman up. However, when Norman checked, the man was already gone, and there was nothing suspicious there. The next morning, Claire experienced something strange. As she tried to enter the house, the door suddenly opened by itself. When she stepped inside, it closed on its own again. An uneasy feeling settled over her. She felt like someone else was inside the house. One day, while playing with her dog, Claire threw a ball into the lake. Usually her dog would jump in to fetch it right away, but this time he looked scared and refused to go near the water. Curious, Claire decided to retrieve the ball herself. However, when she looked into the water, a face suddenly appeared on the surface, mirroring her dog's face. But in an instant, it vanished. Still shaken by what had just happened, Claire got a call from Norman. He told her that he wouldn't be able to come home that night. Claire would have to spend the night alone. With all the strange things that had been happening lately, a deep sense of unease crept over her. That night, as Claire tried to enter the house again, the door suddenly swung open on its own. Feeling uneasy, she stepped inside anyway, but the radio suddenly turned on by itself, blasting a loud noise in the silence of the night. Before she could react, it shut off just as suddenly. A chill ran down her spine. Afraid that someone might be inside the house, Claire rushed to Norman's office and told him everything. Norman went back home with her, but after checking the entire house, she found no one. Norman also reassured her that their neighbor, Warren, wasn't someone to be suspicious of. The next day, while Claire was going about her day at home, she heard something fall. When she looked toward the source of the noise, she saw that a photo of her and Norman had fallen, and the glass frame was shattered. As she bent down to pick it up, her eyes caught sight of Warren, who had just returned home. Feeling curious, Claire put together a basket with some items and went to Warren's house. She tried to peek inside, but all she could see was a mess of random belongings scattered around. Just as she was about to leave the basket quietly, Warren suddenly stepped outside and stared at her suspiciously. "What are you doing here?" Warren asked in a cold tone. Claire felt nervous, but she forced a smile. "I just wanted to welcome you as our new neighbor. Oh, by the way, didn't your wife move in with you?" Warren's expression turned sharp. He didn't answer her question and simply told her to leave. That night, Claire's curiosity grew even stronger. She grabbed a pair of binoculars and started watching Warren's house. But as she was peering through them, Warren suddenly turned and looked straight at her. Claire immediately ducked, holding her breath. When she dared to look again, she realized something even more terrifying. Warren was no longer inside the house. Even worse, there were footprints in the yard, leading toward her home. Her heart pounded. She was sure Warren was heading to her house. But just then, Norman arrived home. "You're acting crazy, Claire," Norman said. "Come on, let's have dinner and forget about all this." During the car ride, Claire felt like something was off. When they drove over a bridge, her phone suddenly stopped working. At dinner with their friends, Claire finally admitted that she had left her band after marrying Norman. The atmosphere grew awkward when Norman suddenly said, Claire has been feeling like there's something in our house lately. Instead of sympathy, everyone just laughed. One night, Claire found a small key inside the air vent. She tried to figure out which cabinet or drawer it could open, but nothing worked. As she stepped into the bedroom, she suddenly noticed steam coming from the bathroom. The door was slightly open, and when she walked in, the entire room was filled with hot steam. Carefully, she reached to unplug the bathtub. But when she glanced into the water, she saw the reflection of someone standing beside her. She screamed in terror. Norman rushed in but found no one there. Claire started questioning her own sanity and eventually went to see a psychologist to talk about everything that had been happening. She also revealed that the figure she saw looked like her, except it had green eyes. Instead of reassuring her, the psychologist suggested something even stranger. Try contacting the spirit. Desperate, Claire bought a Ouija board and invited her friend Jody to help. They sat in the living room with a few candles lit. Claire began calling out to the spirit. Suddenly, a gust of wind blew through the room and the candles went out. The front door swung open on its own. Jody immediately panicked, but Claire tried to stay calm until they realized it was just her dog coming inside. While talking with Jody, Claire revealed that Norman had started acting strange toward her ever since the accident. Jody agreed, saying the accident had been serious, so much so that Norman didn't seem to remember much of what happened afterward. A few days later, another strange incident occurred. While tidying up the house, Claire once again saw steam coming from the bathroom. When she stepped inside, the bathtub was already full, as if someone had intentionally turned it on. Sensing an unseen presence, Claire gathered her courage and asked, "What do you want?" The answer appeared in the form of words, slowly fading on the mirror. "You know." Terrified, Claire ran to her computer to look for clues, and suddenly the screen started typing on its own. A few random letters appeared repeatedly. Meth. Claire was convinced that something was seriously wrong with the house. She went to Norman and insisted that they were not alone there. But Norman just sighed. "You're just stressed, Claire. This is all in your head." Claire was furious at how Norman kept dismissing her. Suddenly, her mind drifted to Warren. She immediately went to a crowded event and found Warren there. Without thinking, she shouted at him in front of everyone. "Murderer! You killed your wife!" But the next moment, a woman appeared from behind Warren. "I'm Mary, his wife," she said, looking confused. Claire froze. If Mary was still alive, then who had been trying to communicate with her all this time? Claire went back to her psychologist, desperate for answers. She talked about Norman's accident and how ever since then, Norman seemed afraid of her. There was something Norman was hiding, and Claire was determined to find out what it was. When she got home, Claire found a book that Jody had left for her. It was about magic and wandering spirits. Just then, Mary arrived and admitted that all of this was her fault for scaring Claire. Mary explained that she had a huge argument with her husband before, but nothing serious had happened. That night, they went to a party, and there, a woman told her that it was the first time they had seen each other again since her accident. When Claire got home, her picture frame suddenly broke again. As she picked it up, she found a piece of paper stuck behind the frame. It was a newspaper clipping about a missing girl. The girl's name was Madison Elizabeth Frank. The moment Claire saw the photo, she was hit with déjà vu. It was the same girl she had seen in the bathtub. Feeling unsettled, Claire asked Norman about Madison. Norman said that Madison was a girl who went missing last year, but he insisted that he didn't know her personally since she wasn't one of his students. Claire started feeling that something was off. She was convinced that the figure she had seen in the bathtub wasn't Mary. It was Madison. Seeing Claire's growing curiosity, Norman began losing his patience. He told her that no matter how hard she tried to understand, she never would. But Claire stood her ground. She was certain that Madison was the one haunting her. Claire's curiosity led her to meet Madison's mother. The woman told her that the police believed her daughter had simply run away, but Claire wasn't convinced. While in Madison's room, she found a strand of hair and secretly took it. When she got home, she performed a ritual using the hair. When Norman found Claire, she started acting strangely, flirting with him in an unusual way. But suddenly, her demeanor turned aggressive. She began talking about how she enjoyed things in a different way. As they were alone, Claire grabbed a knife. Then she turned and saw herself standing at the door in the midst of a rainy night. She then told Norman that his wife was starting to get suspicious. At that moment, her face changed into Madison's. Terrified, Norman immediately threw her off the table. Suddenly, Claire snapped back to reality. She woke up, trembling, and said that she finally remembered everything, the events of the night of the accident. Norman looked pale. Fear started creeping over him. Claire said that on that night, she had come home and found Norman with Madison. Norman couldn't deny it. Claire admitted that their marriage had been in trouble, and at the time, Norman had been tempted by Madison. but the affair only made things worse, leading Claire to leave the house. Claire then met with Jody, and that's when Jody revealed something shocking. Jody had known about Norman's affair with Madison. However, after Claire's accident, Jody chose to stay silent to avoid making things worse. The next day, Claire returned home and found Norman unconscious in the bathtub. He had been electrocuted by a hairdryer that had fallen into the water. Fortunately, the doctors managed to save him. When Norman regained consciousness, he thanked Claire for coming back home. Claire then placed Madison's strand of hair inside a book, thinking about moving on with her life. But Norman still had another secret. He confessed that he had actually tried to break things off with Madison, but she had threatened to kill him. Hearing that, Claire became even more certain. Madison hadn't just threatened Norman while she was alive, but now she had returned as a vengeful spirit. Norman didn't believe it. He tried to convince Claire that it was all in her head, but Claire ignored him and chose to leave. Feeling cornered, Norman reached out to someone experienced in the supernatural. He wanted to arrange a meeting to find a solution. After that, he picked up Claire's spellbook and started reading it. A few moments later, his phone rang. The person he had contacted earlier was calling back. Norman answered and immediately asked about Claire. At that moment, Claire was walking toward the lake, making him curious, so he quickly followed her. From a distance, Norman saw Claire holding a strand of hair in her hand, and without hesitation, she jumped into the water. Under the surface of the lake, Claire found a box, but before she could grab it, Norman suddenly appeared and pulled her back up. They then burned the strand of hair. Even so, Norman told Claire that he believed her and everything she had experienced. After returning home, Claire told Norman that she no longer felt Madison's presence in their house. Norman, in a serious tone, apologized and promised never to do anything like that again. A few days later, Claire and Norman decided to go for a walk. However, Claire wanted to visit the town where Jody had once seen Norman with Madison. While walking around the shops, Claire found a key that looked familiar. She immediately realized that the key matched the box she had seen in the lake. That night, Claire returned to the lake and managed to pull the box out of the water. With trembling hands, she unlocked it using the key. Inside, she found Madison's necklace. At that moment, a terrible feeling crept over her. Norman must have been involved in Madison's disappearance. Claire immediately tried to call the police, but suddenly, Norman appeared out of nowhere. In a cold voice, Norman admitted that Madison was dead, but he denied killing her. According to him, Madison had taken too many pills and arrived at his house in a critical state. When Norman realized it was too late to save her, he had no choice but to sink Madison's body into the lake to cover up what had happened. Norman begged Claire to forgive him, but Claire insisted that they had to call the authorities. Firmly, Norman pretended to call the police and then left. However, after that, Claire had a strange feeling again. She checked her phone and realized that Norman had never actually called the police. Suddenly, Norman appeared from behind and tried to knock her out with a sedative. Claire struggled to escape, but the effects of the drug started to kick in, making her body weak until she finally collapsed to the floor. Norman approached her and, in a cold voice, revealed that Madison had actually planned to report him to the police. That was why Norman had to kill her. Casually, he lifted Claire's body and carried her to the bathroom. He turned on the faucet and then put her into the bathtub. At the last moment, Norman also admitted something shocking. He had never been electrocuted before. It was all a lie he had fabricated to gain Claire's sympathy. Before leaving, Norman called Jody and lied, saying that Claire was in the lab and could be checked on in the morning. However, as he was about to leave, his eyes fell on Claire, who was still wearing Madison's necklace. He tried to take it off, but suddenly, Claire's face changed. It became Madison's. Norman was utterly shocked. Panicking, he lost his balance and fell, hitting his head hard against the sink. Blood started flowing heavily, but with his remaining strength, Norman still tried to attack Claire one last time. However, his body grew weaker. The blood loss increased, and within seconds he passed out. Meanwhile, the faucet continued running, filling the bathtub. Claire was unconscious, and eventually, she sank into the water. Somehow, Claire managed to gather her last bit of strength and unplugged the bathtub drain. Slowly, the water began to recede, giving her a chance to escape. With her weak body, Claire dragged herself out of the bathtub. However, when she looked around, Norman was no longer there. Her heart pounded. Stumbling, Claire made her way to the bedroom and tried to call the police, but the call was cut off. Panicking, Claire searched for Norman and found him unconscious downstairs. Without wasting time, she grabbed the car keys and rushed inside the vehicle. But just as she was about to leave, something sent chills down her spine. The front door was wide open, as if Norman had also managed to get out. With ragged breaths, Claire slammed the gas pedal and sped toward the bridge. She tried calling the police again, but before she could complete the call, Norman appeared from behind. He had been hiding in the car and attacked her immediately. A fierce struggle broke out inside the speeding vehicle. Claire fought back with all her strength and the car lost control, plunging into the lake. Claire tried to swim away, but Norman wouldn't let go. He grabbed her tightly, pulling her back into the car as it quickly filled with water. But at that critical moment, something terrifying appeared. Another car was submerged beneath the lake, and it was Madison's car. Madison's decayed body slowly floated to the surface. Norman, who had been so confident, suddenly panicked. He saw Madison's corpse, and before he could do anything, something even more horrifying happened. Madison's body moved. The corpse's hand clutched Norman's leg tightly. Her pale face and hollow eyes stared at him. Norman screamed in terror, releasing Claire in his panic. Claire didn't waste the opportunity. With her last bit of strength, she swam as hard as she could, escaping from the sinking car. Norman, on the other hand, wasn't so lucky. Madison's hand dragged him deeper, holding him down until he finally sank to the bottom of the lake. Sometime later, Claire visited Madison's grave. Without saying much, she placed a single rose there, a final tribute to a woman whose life had ended so tragically.